Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to start talking about the Neolithic Revolution and really the rise of what we would kind of recognize more as human culture and civilization in the kind of modern world. One of the things here is that, as I mentioned before, this is sort of the product of a lot of archaeology, and this is not a huge overview of archaeology like you would have in a class such as World Prehistory, where we would talk about, the development of the Moche in South America, or the Toltec and Olmec in Central and Egypt, and Angkor Wat and those kinds of things, right? So rather than diving into each particular thing of like, oh, in this year they do this and this, what I'm trying to do is give you an overview of sort of the spread of humans and many of the things that led to those civilizations and societies, all right? So what we're talking about then is the Neolithic Revolution, which is in contrast to the Paleolithic Revolution, right? Paleo means old, lithic means stone. So this is the old Stone Age, right? There's debate about exactly when we ought to put the date of this. By and large, we talk about the Neolithic Revolution happening, but about we used to say 10,000, now we say 12,000. Some people argue we should say 15,000, but really in the 12 to 15,000 year range is what we're talking about. But what is the Paleolithic Revolution? So the Paleolithic Revolution is before this. And the difference between the Neolithic, New Stone Age, and Old Stone Age is really domestication. It is when we move from being small groups of nomadic foragers who are hunting and gathering and fishing and scavenging and moving around chasing food, right? Chasing being, following food, whatever, to becoming settled people who are sort of in charge of making our own food and controlling that. And so we went from groups like this. These are the Hadza people in sub-Saharan Africa, who to this day are still one of the larger forager groups. There's not a lot left in the world, unfortunately. It is a way of life that is going away, but it's also a way of life that is an important history for us. This is what you and I did for 95% of our history as Homo sapiens and before it. Again, we're talking at best 10, 12, maybe a little bit better, 1,000 years ago that humans were doing this. Many cultures, it was even more recent than that. Many parts of the world, it was even more recent than that. So one of the things that I want to talk about is when we say the Neolithic Revolution, a revolution sounds like it's just this huge event that comes out of nowhere and it's absolute chaos and upheaval. And that's not really what was going on there, okay? It was really a slow shift, which you're going to hear me say several times today. The Neolithic Revolution happened slowly over time, right? In the Paleolithic Age, as I had mentioned before, we had started to intentionally plant not crops at first, but things like gourds or maybe peach palms, which we could get fruit from. There's some evidence that people were also doing the same with other consumption items like anything from ayahuasca to tobacco to that kind of stuff, San Pedro cactus, right? All of which are used in shamanistic rituals as hallucinogens for religious purposes, right? These are, and a lot of times are conceived of as various kinds of medicines. Again, traditional health practices often don't see a difference between physical health and spiritual health. So these aren't drugs as you and I think of them, they are medicines as you and I think of them, right? But there is some evidence that they may have been intentionally planting those things as well in various parts of the world. Not everybody used hallucinogens, to be honest with you, despite some popular press people saying otherwise, which are fun stories, but unfortunately there's not a ton of evidence to back that up. But as I said, we went from being very small bands, right, to understand what a giant shift this was. Understand that during the Paleolithic, we probably did not live in groups more than about 50, as I've said before, because if 50 of us are living in this environment right here, it's not going to take long for us to burn up all the firewood, to gather the edible, plants, berries, roots, tubers, fruits, flowers, leaves, all that kind of stuff. It's not going to take long for us to kill the game that's a little bit easier to get to, like squirrels and rabbits and those kinds of things. And it's not going to take long for us to get the bigger game that's available or chase off those that are left, like deer or bear or alligators or manatees or kudu or gazelle or this kind of stuff, right? So depending on the environment that we're in, we may be here for a matter of days or a week. We might be here for a few months, right? It all depends on that relationship that you have with your natural environment and the skills that you have to exploit the resources there, and how rich those resources are. The only time that we have ever seen people who were settled foragers, meaning that they lived in one place all the time, but they were still hunting and gathering. There's only like 2, maybe 3 places. One was actually in the Pacific Northwest, a group called the Kwakiutl, and a couple of other related groups. They were able to live in one place because of the salmon runs, because literally just thousands of salmon, which have a ton of protein, a ton of fat, all these omega-3 fatty acids, right? Your doctor's been telling you to eat salmon, and you've seen all the health reports and stuff. Well, they're right. It's a hell of a food source. And for the Kwakiutl and others in the Pacific Northwest, they don't have to go anywhere, and literally thousands of these things would come up, and they would smoke it, and they would dry it, not smoke it, but they would smoke it like you have smoked meat, and they would dry it out so that it would last a really long time. And so that was an incredible resource. Another area was actually on the coast of Peru, where you have what's called the abysmal trench, where you have 2 tectonic plates, and one is pushing the other up. It makes this very deep trench, and it has an incredible amount of fish, literally right off the shore. And so you can paddle out there in a reed boat. When I was in Peru many years ago, I actually saw a guy do this that I met. He had a reed boat that he had made. He would paddle it offshore, throw a net a couple of times, and then he came back in with like 15 pretty good sized fish. So it doesn't take a lot of energy to be able to provide for the whole village. And the third culture that we see that was settled foragers was actually the Calusa Indians of South Florida, who would fish and collect oysters and mussels. There's more and more evidence that they were intentionally, excuse me, getting oysters to grow by redepositing oyster shells in the Gulf, which would encourage new oysters to attach to old shells and all this kind of stuff that was going on. What you notice there is that all of them were exploiting marine resources, right? And so those that didn't have that kind of marine resource, they had to be nomadic, right? So we were small groups. There was no formal leadership. We didn't have a chief, a king, or whatever. Nobody ruled anybody. We were completely autonomous. If somebody wanted to move, you say, hey, I think we've kind of run out of firewood here. Do you guys think we should go? Nobody gets to command anybody to go. It's built on consensus, because again, there's like 20 to 50 of us that are living in this group, where it's the group is all kin based, meaning that we're all family to each other in some way or another. And so we can decide whether or not we want to move, right? Now, as I said, it wasn't this massive shift. You'll often hear people talk about the great leap forward, which we've discussed a little bit. And the truth is, it really wasn't like that. First of all, I mean, the oldest stolen tools that we have found are 3.3 million years ago in Kenya. So humans have been around for 200,000. So these aren't, tools predate us by millions of years. Okay. And these are the oldest. And you guys have been reading about it. If you look at, moving forward into Oldowan, Montessorian, or Mosterian, I think it's pronounced. I apologize. I speak exactly zero French. They get more and more refined over time. We also see the development of other kinds of tools. These are actually spears. And again, one of the things that people are confused by is the fact that spears are not for throwing. Spears are for thrusting, right? If you threw this, you're going to be wildly inaccurate. And you're also not going to have enough power to kill something. You can't throw a spear and take down a deer or something like that, right? That's not how that works. That's Hollywood. Nobody hunts that way. Nobody's ever hunted that way. Okay, these are for holding and thrusting into the side of an animal. We know from the various evidence that some of the ways that this was done was maybe sit up in a tree over a game trail and wait until an animal walks by, like a deer or a kudu or whatever, and then drop down on the animal and use your body weight and gravity to thrust the spear into the animal and kill it. Because again, I mean, this is, you got to have a fairly high impact, right? Likewise, they would also cooperatively work, and they would herd animals into gullies and valleys that terminated, so that they would corner animals, and then they could run up and spear them and stuff, right? And so these are the oldest spears that we found in the world. They're found in Germany between 380 and 400,000 years ago. Excuse me, and they're associated with Homo heidelbergensis because they even predate Neanderthals, right? The reason I'm bringing these up is because this and the stone tools is because there's this idea that Paleolithic peoples, Paleolithic humans, after we evolved 200,000 years ago, are just sort of living in caves and grunting at each other, and they're, you know, kind of stupid and this kind of stuff. Nothing could be further from the truth. These people were just as intelligent as you and I were. And our ancestors, who frankly probably didn't have our cognitive development, had already figured out how to make stone tools, how to make spears. Probably even Homo sapien neanderthalensis, Neanderthals, were hafting tools, meaning that they would take a stone tool, like what I was just showing you, and actually attach it to a handle to make an axe, to make a blade, right? There's more and more evidence of that, right? And so by the time humans come along, we are the inheritors of this legacy from our ancestors that had already figured out tons of tools and tons of ways to exploit things in our environment, right? There are some things that do appear to be uniquely human. One of them is art. The oldest art that we have is probably about 40,000 years old, maybe a touch better, which again is not to say that that is the oldest art. It is the oldest art found, right? And so that's very much associated with Homo sapiens. Another thing that we did that's kind of unique to us is the fact that we have much more complex tools. So all of the tools that we see, they're not a tool system. They're individual tools. It is a stone axe or a stone blade. Once you get into what I was talking about before, the Oldowan, those big choppers, right? That's we often call a hand axe. The Mosterian tool tradition is these really fine blades, which is a little bit more delicate work. But we're the first ones that have complex, meaning that you have tools that work with other tools. For example, a bow and an arrow, or an atlatl and a dart, right? That's a throwing, what people think of as a throwing spear. It's really a dart. And so we're the first ones to have that. But again, by the time that we get on the scene 200,000 years ago, it's not like we were starting from scratch, right? We inherited tremendous legacies of this, right? We inherited lots and lots of these things, you know. So, you know, get that idea of early humans just sleeping in the bushes like chimps and living in caves and grunting and, you know, that kind of stuff. That's not who we were. It's not even who our nearest ancestors were, given the fact that, for example, Heidelbergensis was hunting with these spears. And again, we know that they would corner them. These spears, by the way, that we found in Germany were associated with something like, I think it's 16,000 animal bones. So these were extremely successful hunters, and they would corner them in caves or in valleys and everything. That indicates that they were cooperating with each other. I have to communicate to you. If I come up with the idea like, guys, if you go over there and you go over there and you go over there and you go, and we form like a sort of perimeter and we herd the animal into this valley, then we can close in on them. We don't have to chase them like lions do or something. We can just get them cornered and then all of us can stab them. I have to be able to communicate with you to tell you that, to express that idea. So this is evidence that probably Heidelbergensis had language. Was it as complex as ours? We have no idea, right? But the idea that they would be able to do this kind of cooperative hunting without language is kind of silly. So again, you know, when we come along, it's already a pretty complex scene that we're talking about, right? But as I said, it is still a big shift to go from foraging to domestication for a lot of reasons that we're about to get into, right? Domestication is something that has been independently invented in many parts of the world, in North America, Central America, South America, in the Near East, and in Asia. And we do know that it was also in Africa because there was some unique things that were domesticated there. Although, because it's a very tropical region through Central Africa, we haven't really been able to establish exactly where. We, through genetic analysis, can look at some of the crops like peanuts that are farmed throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and we know that they come from these wild versions of them, but we don't quite know where, right? Just because we haven't found that yet. So we know it's out there, but we just haven't found it, right? And again, the idea of domestication is the idea of taking wild plants and animals and breeding them intentionally, right? This is not natural selection, right? This is intentional selection. Breeding them for specific traits that we want, to make a bigger fruit, to make a bigger vegetable, to make a more stable stalk, so that the wind doesn't knock it over, to make an animal more compliant or nicer, right? So taking, wolves and turning them into dogs, right? Which, no one likes to say it, but the truth is, how did we go about that? Dogs, by the way, are the oldest domesticated animal. That probably go back about 20 to 25,000 years ago. We did this by, frankly, building a symbiotic relationship with them, feeding them, and frankly, then killing the ones that were more aggressive and more mean and tried to bite us and things like that, and then taking the ones that had traits of a little less aggression, a little more compliant, and keeping those around and breeding those together. And over time, ending up with an animal that, we can teach to do tricks and will listen to all of our commands and those kinds of things, right? But so one of the things that I want to point out here really quickly is on this map, you can see these different ways, these different origins of agriculture, right? Which is invention, something new. And then the blue lines indicate where it diffused, right? Diffusion is that idea that one cultural trait moves from a group to another, right? This happened with domestication. It happened with writing. It happened with sailing. It happened with, computers and cars in the modern era, right? And so these things have happened again and again and again, that one culture comes up with something, or sometimes multiple cultures come up with something, and then it spreads out into other regions, right? One of the myths that I want to dispel that you hear a lot is about looking at the last 500 years of human history. You would be naive not to acknowledge that Europe has dominated the globe in many ways. I mean, let's be perfectly honest here. It was, and I'm not saying it was good, because it, was brutal and terrible and inhuman and genocidal, but it's European countries and cultures that were colonizing North America, Central America, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, that kind of stuff, right? So from a militaristic political standpoint, Europe has really been dominating the globe for 500 years. The question often comes up, why? And the truth is, you get a lot of very racist answers to that. And so, as I think I even mentioned before, right, even my daughter's history book sometimes today, in this day and age in the 20th century, I'll see them and they'll say things like, well, Europeans were very inventive. Excuse me? Are you implying that other cultures are not particularly inventive? In truth, not only is that obviously problematic, it's also factually inaccurate, because Europeans didn't invent writing, Europeans didn't invent agriculture, Europeans didn't invent saddles, Europeans didn't invent stone architecture, Europeans didn't invent metallurgy. All of that was developed elsewhere and came to them through diffusion, right? So, I mean, factually, you can point out that it's not accurate, right? Or you see things that just talk about why Europeans were superior in some way. A lot of European supremacy was frankly just a fluke of geography, right? If any of you have taken cultural geography, you've probably studied this, right? It's something that anthropologists have been talking about for damn near as long as we've been a discipline, right? And it has started to diffuse into other areas, is that with Europe benefited because of the orientation of continents. You see, with domestication, it allows you to have specialization, which I'm going to talk more about, right? With a forager society, 100% of us are involved in the food getting process. There's not enough calories to just go around. I can't just stay home and invent art or become a pottery maker or write books or whatever, right? 100% of us, of able-bodied individuals, are having to get food all the time to feed us and those that can't, such as the very, very young or the very, very old, or occasionally when somebody hurts themselves and they can't go out hunting or gathering that day, right? So all of us are involved in this. With domestication, that changes. We now have a surplus of food. So you can stay home and become a craft specialist. You can stay home and become a woodworker or a potter. You can stay home and really perfect making tools or weapons or those kinds of things. You and I can grow enough now to support a professional soldier, not just a farmer who's trying to fight somebody, but somebody that is trained and that's all they do. And to be blunt, professional soldiers always beat amateur fighters, right? That's the reality of history. So Europe benefits because if you look at how crops grow, moving east-west for crops is very easy. So if you look at like Europe, the Near East, the Far East, Asia, that kind of stuff, most of the crops that are domesticated there, except for maybe if you go up into the mountains or something, you can move east-west because the climate is going to be the same. Moving north-south is very problematic. As many of you know this, if any of you have an agricultural background, you know, right? In Tampa, you can have oranges. I live in Gainesville. It's like an hour and 50 minutes north, and we can't grow oranges here. It's way too cold. That much of a difference going north-south completely changes what crops you can actually grow, right? Florida is terrible for cotton because it just gets too hot and humid and it'll rot. You can grow it here, but it's not great. Georgia, though, really not that far up the road. Again, for me, the Georgia line is, I think it's less than 2 hours up the road. You can grow cotton there, right? Moving north-south has a radical impact on what crops are going to grow. If you look at the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, suddenly you see that that's a problem, right? We are a north-south orientation. And so many of the things, not all of them, some stuff can move, right? Corn, for example, is domesticated in Mexico. It grows fine in North America. But many of the things that are grown in one region can't move north-south. You go 1,000 miles east-west, it's fine. 1,000 miles north-south, 1,000 miles north of here is New Jersey. It's a very different agricultural landscape in New Jersey than it is in Central Florida, right? So Europe benefits because all of these other cultures, not them, that spend generations domesticating these crops, breeding these crops, ending up with a really great crop, Europe can use those, okay? And so it wasn't European geniusness or superiority, it was luck. It was pure dumb luck. It also just so happens that there's certain things that work well because another thing very quickly about crops is you need crops that can store well. So this is one of the problems with growing something like berries, right? Strawberries, blueberries, stuff like that. They don't last well, as many of you know, right? I buy strawberries, and if my kids don't eat them, like a week later, even though I have a refrigerator, they've spoiled, they've gone bad. Well, that's not great if I'm a farmer 10,000 years ago. But other things store really well, like potatoes, right, which were domesticated in the Andes in South America. Those store great, especially if you like kind of squish them and then like dry them. They last. It's called chuño. Last for literally years, right? Other things like rice, right? Wheat, oats, barley. In other words, grains. Grains store amazing. Well, guess what? The Near East, grain is a grass. That's all it is. It's a grass seed. By just chance, it just so happened that the Near East has evolutionarily the largest the largest grass seeds in the world are found there. Of something like the 46 largest grass seeds, something like 42 of them just happened to evolve in the Near East for various environmental reasons, completely unrelated to humans, having to do with plant ecology and evolution and all that kind of stuff. So they had probably the best storable food source in the history of the ancient world, and it was all theirs, right? That means that not only can Europe benefit from their neighbors inventing agriculture and domestication, it means that they can benefit from the fact that what they domesticated was this extremely durable, a very useful product with lots of energy, caloric energy in it, that a few people can grow. And then that way we can have more and more people who are specialized tool makers, professional soldiers, shipbuilders, woodworkers, those kinds of things, right? So it's important to understand that impact, right? So what are we talking about here? We are talking about the fact that the Neolithic Revolution is more of a slow shift. It's not a revolution, right? It did not happen overnight. It took place over thousands of years, right? And it took thousands of years to spread from the origins to their neighbors and those kinds of things, right? And it's the rise of food production that does this, right? In the old world, it was pretty sedentary, right? Like they settled down right away, pretty much. In the new world, what I was talking about, the Mochica civilization, the Kwakiutl, the Calusa, those ancestors, they were still kind of moving around. Central Mexico, they would plant things, and then again, they would leave and come back. They were still nomadic at first. It didn't take them long to start settling down, though. And this is horticulture, not agriculture. Horticulture is farming with the use of only human power. Agriculture is when you get into non-human power, so a draft animal like an ox, or later on a tractor, right? Some of the things that were domesticated, right? Plants in the old world, we have wheat, oats, rye, barley, lentils, peas. What I was talking about, these really durable crops that were really important. Animals, we have cows, we have pigs, we have sheep, we have goats, and three important ones. We have donkeys, horses, and camels. I'll come back to that in a minute. In the New World, we've got the corn, beans, and squash in Central America, which is often called the horticultural trinity or the agricultural trinity. Why is this important? This is important because it demonstrates how intelligent these people were, right? One of the cool things about corn, beans, and squash, two things. One, when you plant those things together, you're actually doing a really sustainable form of agriculture because I usually screw up this order, so forgive me if I misspeak. Corn and beans use nitrogen, right? Or corn, yes. Corn and beans use nitrogen. Squash actually is nitrogen fixing, meaning it takes nitrogen out of the ground and it deposits it through its root system. Again, I may have one of these crossed out. But basically what I'm saying is one of these plants pulls nitrogen out of the ground and out of the air and pumps it into the ground. The other plants then take that nitrogen. You don't have to fertilize these plants. It's a self-fertilizing cycle. Likewise, it's a really smart way to go about this because when you plant the corn, like squash is a vine, it needs to grow up something. You plant the corn, the squash grows up the corn stalk. You don't have to build trellises. You don't have to do these things, right? It's a genius way to go about this, right? It also nutritionally makes a complete protein. It's a complete protein and amino acids. It's basically an extremely healthy meal to have corn, beans, and squash together, not separately, on the same plate at the same time. It's extremely healthy for us. And they figured this out, right? How? Why? I doubt they understood amino acids, but they understood what it was to eat this, that people reacted in a certain way, that it grew better, this kind of stuff. They figured these things out. These are very, very smart people, right? You also had amaranth, which is a kind of grain, gourds, quinoa, tomatoes, chilies, potatoes, those kinds of things. And some of the animals that they domesticated were turkeys, guinea pigs, which again were domesticated as a food source. You and I as Americans have mistaken them for pets, but they were a food source. And finally, llamas and alpacas. Now, I have these animals in bold here. Let me go back to that. Another benefit that Europeans had when it came to things like militarization, colonization, global conquest, this kind of stuff, was the fact that they had more readily available pack animals, okay? Donkeys, horses, and camels, you can ride. right? You can ride these things, you can hunt from these things, you can go to war on these things, and that's going to massively increase your range of movement, and it's going to give you a huge military advantage. The Americas didn't have those things, right? A lot of people don't realize horses were not in the Americas, okay? There's a lot of argument and debate about maybe we had some here that were worth domesticating, but they got killed off when we were still very Paleolithic, when we were hunters. And so we killed a lot of the megafauna, it's often called, that we could have domesticated and ridden. What we ended up with was llamas and alpacas found in South America, primarily in the Andes. The truth is you can't ride these animals. You can use them as a little bit of a pack animal, but they can't pull a plow, and you can't ride them. Because of their bone structure, you'd kill them, right? You can't put that much weight on a llama or an alpaca. So because of this, this is going to limit both range of movement, it's going to limit the potential for cavalry, it's going to limit chariots, it's going to limit you from dragging a cannon into war, these kinds of things. So this is another example of how it's not that Europeans were brilliant, it was that there just wasn't another option in the New World, right? There was nothing to ride. And again, that was just a luck of geography, okay?